to welcome you to this high-level panel of Humanitarian Affairs segment of Economic and Social Council on combating and preventing sexual gender-based violence in humanitarian crisis. I would like to welcome our distinguished panelists from member states, humanitarian organizations, and civil society, who will speak to key issues and provide experiences and promising practices to address sexual and gender-based violence. Humanitarian crises have different impacts on women, girls, boys, and men. Existing inequality may be further exacerbated during and after crisis, disproportionately affecting women and girls, including exposure to gender-based violence, including sexual violence. In humanitarian crisis, we see all types of sexual and gender-based, especially when family and community protection mechanisms have broken down. The high-level panel is therefore an opportunity to highlight the disproportionate impact of emergencies on women and girls and reinforce the importance of prioritizing their experiences, protection, capacities, and leadership, in particular their experiences of gender-based violence. This year, as we mark the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 20th anniversary of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, it is highly important that we take stock of the work still ahead. The importance of this high-level panel is only cemented with the global pandemic of COVID-19 that heightens pre-existing risk of gender-based violence. High-level event places gender equality at the heart of our work, and I am pleased to join the panelists and everyone participating from around the world today as we spend the next 1.5 hours to hear about key issues and experiences and promising practices to address sexual and gender-based violence. I welcome our moderator and the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief, my good friend, Mark Lowcourt, and I invite him to conduct the panel discussion. I look forward to a productive exchange of views, but before giving the floor to Mark, I would like to welcome Her Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway. Welcome, we are very pleased to have you with us. It's a great signal of the commitment of Norway in this very important and very sensitive issue. Personally, I still keep a good souvenir of the meetings you organized in your country a few months ago. Thank you very much and welcome. My dear Mark, mic is yours.
Well, Omar, thank you very much indeed. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon, combating and preventing sexual and gender-based violence. And I'm enormously privileged to be your moderator today. So let me introduce the panel. As Omar said, we're very grateful to have with us Ina Eriksen Søreide, Norway's Foreign Affairs Minister, who is such a champion of women's and girls' empowerment and a tireless advocate against sexual and gender-based violence. We have renowned author and activist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who's written powerfully about the experiences of women and girls in her books, including We Should All Be Feminists. We're also joined by Eleanor Rakes, Vice President and Head of Programme Delivery at the International Rescue Sexual Violence Operations Manager from the International Committee of the Red Cross in South Sudan, and by Fatima Shehu Imam, the founder and Executive Director of the Rehabilitation, Empowerment and Better Health Initiative in Nigeria. And all of them are working daily from operational and policy perspectives to prevent sexual and gender-based violence. I want also to welcome my UN colleagues, Natalia Karnan, the Executive Director of the UN Population Fund, Henrietta Fore, Executive Director of UNICEF, and Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner for refugees. This is a time of great challenge. COVID-19 has upended every sphere of our lives. The virus has multiplied threats to human rights and dignity. It's forced us to take a hard and, I hope, honest look at inequalities and how we protect our most vulnerable. COVID-19 threatens to reverse the progress we made in advancing gender equality and women's rights. Many women and girls have faced gender-based violence, including sexual violence and sexual exploitation and abuse. And in many places, calls to hotlines have increased by 30, 40% or more since quarantine and lockdown measures were put in place. But this is also a moment of opportunity, an opportunity to act fast and in unity while there is global momentum to recover better from the pandemic. So we have to pull together to put girls and women at the center of our efforts through a whole system approach, working with local communities, civil society, governments, regional organizations, donors, humanitarian and development organizations, not just the specialists responsible for work on gender-based violence and responders, but everybody. Leaders in particular have to engage with service providers, gathering information and data on needs and priorities from community-based groups and women's groups. There are a set of reasons why we need to prioritize this at the moment. It's not just that 1 in 3 women will experience some form of physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, and that will be probably worse if the woman has a disability, but because what we're seeing is some of the ways in which COVID-19 is playing out is exacerbating gender-based violence. So we have to prioritize and fund services for survivors of all forms of gender-based violence. And we have to promote the leadership and meaningful participation of women in decision-making, including in leadership levels in the humanitarian community. Above all, we have to address gender inequality, which is the underpinning driver of so many of the problems we're having to address. My office, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is trying to play its part, responding to and preventing gender-based violence in humanitarian emergencies. We were very pleased last year in May to co-host with the government of Norway and others the Oslo conference on ending sexual and gender-based violence. We are, with our Norwegian co-hosts, tracking progress made by member states and organizations on hundreds of political policy and practical commitments and financial commitments to collectively strengthen accountability for addressing gender-based violence. People made promises in Oslo, and we are tracking whether those promises are being kept, and we hope to share the results at the General Assembly in September. We're also prioritizing gender equality and addressing gender-based violence in our response to the pandemic through the Global Humanitarian Response Plan the Secretary General launched for COVID-19. And we're doing this because responding to gender-based violence reduces suffering and saves lives. So let's hear now from our panel. I'm delighted to start with Ina Eriksen Søreide from Oslo. As we've said, she's a staunch advocate on the issues of gender equality and sexual and gender-based violence. Ina, can you tell us, further to the Oslo conference, how you think humanitarian organizations and member states need to further support mitigation, response and prevention of GBV in the current circumstances? You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you also for this wonderful opportunity to engage with you on a topic that is, as you said, Mark, very close to my heart, and you have been vital yourself in actually making possible many of the engagements that we've had. And you mentioned the Oslo conference, and I will get to that very shortly. Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends, in many of the meetings I've had, first as a defense minister and now as a foreign minister, I've encountered stories about truly horrific acts of sexual and gender-based violence. The systematic gang rape of girls and women. We have heard about boys and girls who have been maimed for life of sexual violence. We have heard about men who have been sexually abused as child soldiers or detainees. We all know that sexual and gender-based violence is targeting civilians, tearing apart the very fabric of society, making sure families are being deprived of their dignity and they have traumas for years and for decades. And this is a real grave violation of human rights, of international humanitarian law. It can be a war crime, it can constitute a crime against humanity, and also an act of genocide. And as we all know, impunity is unfortunately widespread. So we must ensure that the fight against sexual and gender-based violence remains high on the humanitarian agenda. And that's why I again want to thank Mark and thank OCHA for convening not only this meeting, but being such a staunch supporter of this agenda. And I also want to thank my friend Omar for the very nice introduction and also for convening this meeting. Morocco is a true friend and partner in this. Just over a year ago, as Mark mentioned, we had a conference in Oslo, the first ever thematic conference on ending sexual and gender-based violence in humanitarian crisis. And I'm very proud of what we achieved there together with our co-hosts. We were co-hosting with Iraq, Somalia, the United Arab Emirates, and with OCHA, UNFPA, and the Icrc. And we had more than 1,000 participants, and many of whom were representing local organizations, civil society. And I think, to be very honest, that the conference itself was a very important, it was a milestone in actually bringing all of these actors together. As far as I know, this was also the first time ever that the UN and the Icrc had collaborated on a conference like this. We would like to do more of that because we see that it has an effect. We have made more progress since then, and Mark mentioned we are now tracking all the commitments that we got in. And it is actually very interesting to see how it mobilized both financial but also political support for putting this high on the agenda. And I would now like to make 3 points about how I believe we can move this forward, and also looking at the outcomes of last year's conference. First, we have to address the challenges that are now posed by the COVID-19. Restriction of movement, curfews, women being trapped at home with their abusers, limited access to essential health care, and all these factors are giving rise to serious concerns. And I'm sure that Natalia will say something about this later on, but UNFPA has pointed out that progress towards ending sexual and gender-based violence will probably be hit by a huge backlash in the months to come. Reaching the targets by 2030 is now likely to slow down dramatically. And what the UNFPA sees now is that an additional 15 million SGBV cases are expected every 3 months that the lockdown continues. That's a dramatic figure. And it is actually just adding on top of all of the other challenges that we see from this crisis. I would really like to commend OCHA and Mark for coordinating COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan. We have already earmarked funding for the activities of the UNFPA under this response plan. Second, we have to maintain the momentum that we saw from the Oslo conference, but also continue to making this a priority in our humanitarian policies. We got more than $360 million in commitments financially during the conference. We are now also tracking several hundred commitments on policies, normative issues, response services, leadership, coordination, all of it. And we are now delivering our commitments. We have now allocated around 350 million Norwegian kroner a year to the SGBV fight. We promised a billion Norwegian kroner over 3 years, and we are very well on track to delivering that. But we also follow up on the political commitments. And as you may know, last Friday, we were very proud to launch, together with the UN, our very brand new handbook that is supposed to be used for UN field missions in how to prevent and to combat conflict-related sexual violence. This was an initiative from Norway a couple of years ago, been working very closely with the UN, and now the result is here. My third point is that we have to put the survivors at the center of our response and our approach. We have to also recognize that women and girls are also very powerful agents of change, not only in their own lives and communities, but they're also key actors in the humanitarian response. This was also one of our main messages in Oslo, and the fact that we were able to put together civil society, governments, organizations, everyone who has something to contribute in this fight was actually vital. We can achieve better results if we are working together. And a call to action on protection of gender-based violence in emergencies is also a very important part of this context. Just let me end by saying, dear colleagues, dear friends, that addressing SGBV has to be a priority in all our humanitarian responses. We issued a new action plan on our humanitarian strategy a year and a half ago, and this was at the very center and the very core of this plan. Protecting people at risk and providing assistance to survivors must be at the core of both the humanitarian response, but also the long-term response. And again, thank you so much for convening this, and I'm looking very much forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. Thank you very much, Mark.
No, well, Ina, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to go next to my colleague and good friend, Natalia Karnen, the Executive Director of UNFPA, who's very well known not only for her work at the UN Population Fund, but also with the private sector on youth issues, including right back to the 1990s with the Ford Foundation. Natalia, Ina teed you up just there to talk a bit about what more must be done to advance gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls in humanitarian settings and transforming norms and systems that perpetuate gender inequality. What is your message to us today, please?
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much, everyone, excellencies, distinguished delegates, and Minister Ina. We do meet at an unprecedented time. COVID-19 is exposing the stark inequalities and injustice in the world. And what I would like to add to the discussion is precisely what was just put on the table by Ina, the need for survivor-centered services and gender justice. And what better time than now? We're commemorating a year since Oslo. That was quite an impressive rallying of the international community. Now, 25 years after Beijing, and 20 years since Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, we are witnessing this pandemic, and we see the surge in violence against women and girls. In Iraq, a rapid assessment exercise on gender-based violence conducted by UNFPA and a coordinated group of civil society partners, very important, showed us that domestic violence there accounts for 94% of the reported incidents of gender-based violence during this time of COVID. And 40% of health service providers indicated an increase in the number of women who were coming to seek assistance. In just 2 months, heartbreakingly, 123 suicide attempts resulting from gender-based violence. And that's just one example, very telling among many. And the only response is stop. This has to stop. In every home, in every community, in every refugee camp, in every country, it must stop. Now, UNFPA has kept our focus on getting to zero gender-based violence in all its forms by the year 2030, as the Sustainable Development Goals demand. Zero gender-based violence, including harmful practices such as gender-based violence and the harmful practice of child marriage. And to get to zero, we need to make zero tolerance a reality. UNFPA took urgent action, always in concert with our partners in Bangladesh, for example, to provide an integrated sexual and reproductive health service capacity. Very important part of that is mental health, psychosocial support. We strengthen the capacity of health workers to adapt the referral pathways so that women walk in, they can get the services that they need. In Sudan, the Ministry of Social Affairs there set up the first ever gender-based violence hotline. Now, through our leadership in this cluster area, the GBV area of responsibility, we've tried to provide guidance, and more guidance is required to promote the shared learning between countries. How do we manage cases? How do we adapt these services so we can respond in real time during the pandemic? Much more has to be done because we are witnessing horrifying atrocities. Sexual and intimate partner violence, forced early and child marriage going up, sexual enslavement, forced pregnancy, human trafficking. It's all part of a piece, and it's a health risk that has profound traumatic outcomes. Mental health, yes. Adverse reproductive outcomes, yes. Poor sexual health, disability, and death, and sometimes passed on trauma to the next coming generations. So this is a global emergency. It's something that is very worthy of our full commitment, collaboration, and mobilization. Women and girls cannot wait. And globally, as we know, more than 240 million women and girls between the ages of 15 and 49 suffer physical or sexual violence at the hands of an intimate partner every single year. 35% of women have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner, 35%. And some women experience both. Unacceptable. Our recent study in which we joined UN Women, which was based on data from Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Somalia, found just recently that 39% of the humanitarian ask for women and girls was covered. This is in contrast to 69% of the overall. And the consequences of this have been devastating. This is why we're appreciative of this moment with ECOSOC to call attention to the need for increased investment in these services because they are life-saving. Prevention first, and of course, the response to gender-based violence. And we're also talking about changing harmful social norms. That means working with communities. It means working with women, but also with men, with girls and boys, and supporting local leadership, especially local women's organization who can help to design and deliver the response. So in closing, I'd like to say, let us heed the United Nations Secretary General's call to place the safety of women and girls at the center of all COVID-19 appeals and response plans, and let us designate life-saving, gender-based violence services as essential, because they are. Now, as we stand together for the rights and the safety and dignity of women and girls everywhere, we must take action every day for gender equality and justice, for the peace that we need in our hearts, in our homes, in our communities, and in this world. Thank you so much, Mark and colleagues, for the opportunity.
Well, Natalia, thank you so much. It's a huge honor now to be able to introduce Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. You all know her books, I'm sure, Half of Yellow Sun, Americana. I mentioned earlier, We Should All Be Feminists. You've often written and spoken about the importance of having multiple narratives and recognizing that. And especially the importance of prioritizing women and girls' experiences and stories. So can you please share with us now some of your thoughts on this topic? You have the floor. Please go ahead. I'm so sorry. So we're not hearing you, but I understand you're online. Could you just try, if you have a mute button on your computer, could you just try pressing that?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Lupoc. Thank you to everyone there, all the panelists. It's very nice to be here to have the chance to say a few words. I remember when somebody said to me some years ago, why do you call yourself a feminist? Why don't you just say that you're a humanist? And I said, calling myself a feminist, of course, doesn't mean that I don't realize that everyone in the world has suffered. You know, men have suffered. But I think it's my recognition that women and girls have historically been excluded, diminished, oppressed. And to call myself a feminist is to say that we need to do better collectively. And so I want to talk about two young women today. The first one, her name is Vera. Her name was Vera Omazuwa. She was 22 years old. She was a student at the University of Benin in Nigeria. She was raped and murdered just 2 weeks ago. Another woman, actually a girl, not a woman, she was 12 years old. Her name was Farishna. She was from Jigawa State in Nigeria. She was raped by 11 men. And I want to start by talking about them because I think it's important to talk about language. What I've noticed in the reactions to these horrific rapes is that there's a language around rape and sexual assault of women that we really need to start to think about and talk about. What language do we give girls to talk about their bodies? What language do we give boys to talk about what girls and women represent in our societies? I think that there is an epidemic of male entitlement towards female bodies. It's a global epidemic, and it's something that we need to address. When I was growing up, I don't think I had the language to talk about. Had I been the victim of sexual assault, I would not have known how to talk about it. The word for vagina in my language, Igbo, is loaded with shame. And if you're a good girl, you're not supposed to know that word. And so it matters how we teach girls to talk about these things, because if they don't have the language, then they don't feel equipped to talk about what's happening to them. But it's not even just about the language. It's also about how we as a society react to girls and women talking about assault. And it's not just men. I think it's also important for all of us to acknowledge that it's men and women that seek to silence women and girls who talk about their experiences. We live in a culture that diminishes women, and so both men and women participate in that culture. There have been so many really disappointing views from Nigerians asking questions like, what was the girl wearing when she was raped? Or what was she doing where she was? As though what she's wearing or what she was doing somehow justifies her having been raped. And so I think it's important for us to really start to question, interrogate the language that we use, how we talk about these things, because how we talk about things really matters. We need to find ways to make talking about these things both ordinary and heroic. We need to say to young boys before they become men that they do not have any entitlement to women's bodies. And we need to tell girls before they become women that their bodies belong to them. And of course, it's all easy to say because it's very complicated. But I think even interrogating the ways in which we use culture, that word culture, the ways in which we use culture to evade is very encouraging. It's really important that we listen to women. Women like the woman on the panel who's done women like Fatima Shehu Imam, whose work I've been following, who's done such important work with the civil society in northern Nigeria. Women like her but also just women on the ground. We need to start to hear women, to listen to women. And I just want to end with a little story about a friend of mine who's, who's a good man, who's European, who's liberal, who believes in equality. And he was talking to me about having bought Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. And he said, I bought many copies and I'm going to give them to all my female friends. And I remember saying to him, well, why all your female friends? And he was a bit taken aback. But what that showed me is this, I think, very stubborn idea that somehow women's stories are for women alone. I think we need to change that. I think we need to make women's stories universal stories. Men need to hear women's stories. And maybe if we have more men hearing women's stories, maybe we can start getting ahead in that idea that men are not entitled to women's bodies. So I'll end here now. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you very much indeed for such a powerful and moving contribution. I should perhaps confess that my daughter bought Michelle Obama's book for me. I don't know what
that's a good sign.
But thank you so much. It was a really powerful contribution. We really appreciate your joining us today. And I'm thrilled now actually to introduce somebody you referred to, Fatima Shehu Imam, who's the founder and executive director of the Rehabilitation Empowerment and Better Health Initiative in Nigeria. Originally, we were going to hear from Fatima a bit later on, but I think it would be great to hear from you now, Fatima, if you could, building on the contribution we've just had, tell us a bit about your experience since the Oslo conference, because you were there with us that day, and you have really, I think, important insights into the important role of civil society, in particular women leaders in civil society, and the contribution that you can make, especially in communicating to men. So please, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start by sharing a personal experience. As a women leader and also part of the civil society in northeastern Nigeria, I have had the opportunity of engaging with humanitarian and development actors at different levels, at the regional as well as at international level, from Nairobi to Oslo to Geneva to New York. And every time I am so excited and enthusiastic to actually impute, to contribute, and to advocate for change. My participation has always raised expectations in the minds of civil society generally, but particularly in the minds of women, vulnerable women and girls. During those engagements, a lot of promises are made. A lot of commitments are made. However, what is lacking is the political will to implement these commitments. And every time, these women always wish it will not be business as usual. And that explains the frustrations, the disappointment, as well as the impatience from these acutely vulnerable women and girls. Here I am, once again. The issues are still there. The forces are still there. The systemic problems are still there. In fact, all we get to see that COVID-19, for example, has only accentuated and further exacerbated the already existing challenges that we face regarding sexual and gender-based violence. Issues in northeastern Nigeria, for example, women and girls are the face of the crisis because they account to more than 80% of the affected population. However, their voice and agency remain silent and marginalized because of pre-existing gender inequalities. that has led to lack of meaningful participation of the women and girls. The space continues to shrink, either because of male dominance or patriarchy, or like I said in the beginning, because of pre-existing gender inequality issues. These women do not have the space to actually make decisions about matters that affect them and their children. Most often, women and girls' capacity is undermined. Their abilities is not recognized. Their voices is not amplified. They are not visible at all. And because mainly women-led organizations are at grassroots level, issues of capacity are thrown at them. Issues of conforming to one policy or to another system. But I think what we need to recognize is the fact that international systems and policies that are rigid need to change and not the other way around. So if we are going to talk about challenges that really affect women-led organizations, it has to do with issues of preference and prioritization by donors of international actors for funding. We all know that funds is very important and essential to ensure that the desired impact is achieved. There is the need for women-led organizations to be given that opportunity to do what they know how to do best. These are women that are mainly first responders that do what they're doing even without support. So we need the support and encourage them. And also, there is the need to encourage equal partnership. Most often what we see is this unequal partnership that exists between the international actors and the local actors. That is highly detrimental to the women-led organizations. That brings me to the second part of your question, Mr. Moderator. How do we do it? First and foremost, we need to encourage women's participation. And by participation, we're referring to meaningful participation, not just to tick the box or just to be at the table, but we have to be on the table in numbers so that our voices would be heard and so that collectively we can be able to make the desired change. We can be able to collectively advocate for issues that affect us in the ways that only us can be able to say it, and only us do know it. Secondly, there is the need to really bring decision-making closer to the grassroots by taking power closer to the grassroots and taking it away from the international actors. By also changing the system of male dominance to a system where women play a very central role. And I think I need to be very clear here. We're not looking for a situation that we're going to create competitiveness or unhealthy rivalry between women and men. We're looking for a situation where we will collaborate and complement each other to tackle the problems of GBV that is affecting all of humanity. It is also very important for us to understand that as international actors, we should not be seen to be reinforcing discriminatory social norms. We're supposed to take advantage of opportunities that does exist within the humanitarian and development context, to recognize it, and then to help in changing those power imbalances that does exist and such discriminatory social norms that is hindering women and women-led organizations' participation. It is also very important to recognize that whatever we want to do would have to put women and women-led organizations in the heart of our response. Often, we design programs with minimal consultations of women and women-led organizations. During the planning stage, during design stage, we hardly consult them, and that results in lack of impact. Most often, the desired impact is not achieved. So we would like to see a situation where there is equal partnership between donors and local actors, and here specifically, I'm talking about women-led organizations that is mutually beneficial, a kind of partnership that the local actors can be able to hold them accountable, where the voice and agency, local actors, especially women-led organizations, will be amplified and not their capacities undermined. So I am trying to say, in essence, that there is the need to translate all these commitments into action. We have been from one continent to the other, from one country to the other. We have done a lot of talking. And every time we come back to the same situation every time. There is the need to put in more action to those commitments to ensure that there is an accountability. They ensure that those commitments those making the commitments can be held accountable to ensure that they are not just promises, because we're talking about human lives. We're talking about lives, and we're saying that every life matters. So thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Moderator and my fellow colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Henrietta, you also were with us in Oslo, where UNICEF made some extremely bold and ambitious commitments on ending gender-based violence. How have you found the experience over the last year in taking all of that forward? And what do you think the priorities for us all should be now?
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you also to Omar. It is very nice that both of you as men have assembled an all-women's panel. So thank you very much for caring about this issue deeply. We all really appreciate that. So may I chime in and add to my sister panelists that we are all deeply concerned about the increase of gender-based violence during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know and we see every day that the color of your skin or the sex at your birth still determine life, death, and the probability of violence. It's especially true for women and girls, and they encounter unspeakable levels of violence, even worse now in times of crisis. We must remember that it's not unique. Gender-based violence increases at every humanitarian emergency, and Natalia and UNFPA have much good statistics around this, and I'm very pleased that Norway and the foreign minister, her leadership, Ina's leadership, has really led to bringing out many of these statistics. We must all stand together, and the collective action is helpful. So if I may just give a stamp of approval to the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies. It was collaborative. It reflects Natalia's work that women and girls cannot wait. And Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's words about the brutality of raping 12-year-old girls and the urgency of eloquence in ordinary and heroic language so that we can change hearts and minds. But with that, Mark, let me turn to what happened in Oslo, because we did make some bold announcements and we were not sure if we could reach them, but I have some good news. So let me address the answer. In just 1 year, we made some significant progress, and I will mention 3 areas. The first is we have increased coverage of gender-based violence programs quickly. In 2019, we reached 3.3 million women and children with these programs. It's more than 3 times the number that we reached in 2018. We could not have done this without our civil society and nonprofit partners. We also increased the number of countries in which we specifically addressed GBV in emergencies. So 71% of our UNICEF 2020 humanitarian appeals for children now included. And by 2021, it will be at 100%. We nearly doubled the number of countries reporting GBV work as a part of the response to COVID-19. and we will extend this to all 130 countries in the next 2 months. So the good news here, Mark, is that what we had responded to, committed to, was 50% of the hacks would include GBV by 2020, and we exceeded that. So we're thankful that we're moving. The second report is that we have adapted and expanded GBV response services to keep life-saving programs up and running. So let me give you 3 quick examples on adapting and 1 on expanding. In adapting, at the country level, together with partners, including local women's organizations, we've made strategic shifts to minimize the interruption of services for gender-based violence over the last few months, so that in Lebanon and in Somalia, we've scaled up remote service provision through helplines and hotlines, providing mental health and psychosocial support that women and girls trust. Pardon me. In Sudan and in refugee camps in Bangladesh, female volunteers conduct regular house visits to share information on how to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And they use these visits as an opportunity to raise awareness about GBV services in the community. And then a second example on adapting at the global level on case management. This is fundamental to addressing the mental health consequences of GBV that Natalia mentioned. It is becoming even more important because of COVID-19. These are policies in the area of GBV responsibility, and there's a help desk that UNICEF funds and manages with UNFPA across all contexts. It includes digital and low technology options. We also partnered with the International Rescue Committee to issue tips on how to adapt specialized programming for adolescent girls. And this has really been popular and it's important. And then thirdly, on adapting, in Zimbabwe and Jordan, we have been advocating to ensure that GBV and child protection social workers continue to work through the issuance of special permits, providing hygiene kits and protective gear in Jordan, and for the Ministry of Justice to consider GBV cases in Zimbabwe. And in expanding the work, we have focused on the humanitarian needs overviews and the response plans through the clusters that we lead. We have led risk mitigation through the entire program focus. So let me now turn to our third commitment, which is in line with the SG's call to put women and girls at the center of COVID-19 through funding appeals and response plans and innovative financing instruments and approaches. We are now putting them in as blended public and private investments to end GBV, and we need to reimagine how financing can be done to address this issue. So 2 things I would close with. We want to reimagine a world where girls and women can live in this world without fear. So first, we must continue to increase coverage of GBV programs. It should be at the center of all of our humanitarian response plans and in the UN's framework for socioeconomic response to COVID-19. There are 124 countries who have answered the SG's calls, but we need to make sure that it covers all girls and all women. We must also make sure that it covers the social workers who are trained in GBV for humanitarian crisis. And second, we must ensure that the work is financed. So the foreign minister, Ine, mentioned about her finance and about the handbook, and this is all extremely important. But GBV must be valued as essential to recovery. So to help do this, today we are launching at UNICEF a due diligence tool that will help governments and investors understand how gender-based violence undermines investments that we're making. But if we tackle it and include it, it will increase overall development results. So thank you very much. UNICEF is proud to stand with you all today and to reimagine a world in which girls and women no longer live with fear. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Henrietta. Let me now turn to Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. Among the most vulnerable women and girls on the planet are those who are displaced, either refugees or displaced in their own country. And they're particularly vulnerable to sexual exploitation and abuse, which is an issue that Kelly champions. So, Kelly, please give us your perspective on this set of issues we're trying to make progress on today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm just delighted to be on this panel of wonderful activists for this conversation. I have to congratulate you for putting together a great set of voices in terms of trying to raise up this particular topic, which we agree needs more amplification, and now is the moment. Norway certainly a year ago really lifted it to another place, and to have this conversation and dovetailing it with the call to action, we're delighted. We too agree that now is the time to be looking very seriously, including with issues related to forced displacement, on systemic inequalities. We know that women and girls are at particular risk, and in those refugee and IDP communities, they can be the most marginalized. So in terms of attention, and when we look at the impact of the current pandemic, and you mentioned it, the minister has mentioned it, Fatima just mentioned it, the need really to invest to address gender inequality, power imbalances, and structural discrimination at every level. And so what we see in the issues related to the forcibly displaced, we see an increased exposure to gender-based violence. And you heard that obviously from Natalia and from Henrietta in some of the areas that we're working in close collaboration with them, and obviously a large number of partners dedicated to this issue. Because what we see is, of course, in a situation where we are now, in situations when we are trying to prevent the spread of the infection, home is often not the safest place to be, even if that home is temporary. So we have to take particular care, especially when it comes to issues related to sexual exploitation and abuse, to make sure that we aren't seeing an increase in incidents. We know with economic impacts, in particular, people losing their livelihoods, the potential for survival sex with children out of school. These are areas where we have a potential of having fewer reporting options for those very people most at risk in such a circumstance. Now, for us, for UNHCR, adapting some of the gender-based violence programmings to address these urgent needs becomes critical. And some of these were mentioned earlier, particularly by Natalia. Issues related to remote case management, this becomes critical. How do we get increased emergency cash support? And we've seen the socioeconomic impacts for our portion of the Global Humanitarian Response Plan. 40% of that is to try to lift up the cash support that we have. This will go as a direct complement to what we're trying to do to prevent gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and abuse. The referral mechanism related to GBV was mentioned. Information to communities becomes important. We know that women and girls are bearing the disproportionate brunt of the crisis, but we're also very inspired by the leadership of many refugee women's organizations that are stepping forward in terms of leadership and response. Fatima had mentioned this, of course, and we've seen this clearly, both in the Global Refugee Forum last year, but also now in terms of response to the pandemic, and trying to make sure that we don't roll back some gains that we've made on prevention of GBV and sexual exploitation and abuse. A couple of examples, if I might, Mark, to complement, although Henrietta's list was quite extensive in terms of what UNICEF has carried forward. And she mentioned the strong collaboration among partners, and we want to recognize that as well. I think the call to action has been an important way to demonstrate that kind of partnership. In Uganda, we have a very important helpline with 15 different languages related to referrals with trained protection staff and counselors that are available to be able to talk to those that are facing particularly in restricted environments that the pandemic is presenting help. In Cameroon, we have adapted programming related to remote case management with community volunteers, for example, to reach out. Several of our panelists talked about Bangladesh. We have a different tact where we have used a partnership with BRAC, of obviously an important local NGO, on GBV prevention, for example, involving positive male role models. And again, the importance of having men as part of this conversation, fathers and brothers, becomes critically important. And in Colombia, as a last example, shelters for survivors in some of the border areas of the region, when now we see, particularly in the pandemic, so many more people losing livelihoods and losing their homes and places to live. Now, in terms of the what we've seen practically with regard to response, I think, Mark, in April, we launched as part of the championship a community outreach and communications fund for local NGOs. And again, we get to the issue of first responders being so critically important to preventing sexual and gender-based violence. We had 1,200 applications from local NGOs for this fund from 70 different countries, which you can see the need for being able to provide yet more support to those first line responders to be able to address this. So we know that there are immediate needs now. There will be longer term impacts, and the impact will be felt particularly on women and children. And we need to be ready, as some other panelists have said, to address the trauma and the effects of GBV, including during the current lockdown. And the impact, of course, will be importantly, unfortunately, felt by women and children primarily. Thank you very much, Mark. Honored to be with our fellow panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly, for that, and for all your championing of this agenda with Filippo as well, the High Commissioner for Refugees, who's been a terrific champion in this area in the last, over many years actually, but especially in the last year when he's had the championship role in particular. So we're now going to hear from Christine Sayson, who's the Sexual Violence Operations Manager for the International Committee of the Red Cross in South Sudan. Christine, thanks for joining us. Now, this work in protecting women and girls from gender-based violence can't be done, obviously, without the engagement and support of governments and local authorities. So how does ICRC work with them and with armed actors, for that matter, to build capacity and compliance with international humanitarian law, but also with basic norms and standards to protect women and girls? Please give us your thoughts.
Thanks very much for the interesting question. And I also did want to thank the valuable insight that was shared earlier from Ms. Caroline Ogwang, the director of the South Sudan Women with Disabilities Network, in an earlier panel. And also certainly the very interesting remarks shared by Ms. Adichie on the importance of language and approach, but also very much the very real and personal impact that sexual violence has. For the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Sexual Violence Strategy and our Sexual Violence Special Appeal of 2020 commits the ICRC to addressing sexual violence globally, and particularly in 14 contexts of armed conflict, other situations of violence, and in places of detention for us to realize as priority. The ICRC has a clear role to play in addressing sexual violence as a violation of international humanitarian law and in relation to international human rights law in conflict, detention, and other situations of violence, which are the settings in which we operate. And indeed, IHL provides us with a key entry point for our operational work on the issue. And I'd like to tell you a bit more about how we address sexual violence in operations, and then focus in a bit on some lessons for engagement with authorities. The sexual violence work of the ICRC is not new in our 150-year history. We've worked on sexual violence, especially through our health and protection programs, for a great many years, because it's an unfortunate and an unfortunately constant reality in the context in which we work. Violations of IHL remain our utmost concern. Because of this, the ICRC's institutional strategy on sexual violence highlights that the ICRC takes a reversed burden of proof approach related to our sexual violence work, which means that the ICRC will assume that sexual violence takes place in locations where we work, unless we prove otherwise. And this does not mean that the ICRC is not going to continue to be data and evidence-based in our approach, but rather that our starting point is a proactive one, acknowledging the unfortunately overwhelming prevalence of sexual violence. What we all also know is that sexual violence almost never occurs in a vacuum. It's often part of a continuum of violence exacerbated by other variables such as economic insecurity, displacement, physical insecurity, etc. The role of the ICRC sexual violence advisors, operational managers such as myself, are to take a multidisciplinary approach and support the different departments in ICRC operations in integrating sexual violence prevention and response concerns. It's also to work with, map, and understand risks and trends of the at-risk groups with whom we work. In South Sudan, where I work, the ICRC runs a community-based protection program, placing the people we work for at the center of our operational planning and considerations. The community-based protection workshops in South Sudan brings together members of the community and ICRC staff in order to develop a greater understanding of their specific needs, vulnerabilities, and capacities, and to engage in a structured discussion with, amongst other groups, women and girls. These workshops focus on pulling out concrete outcomes and conclusions. And of course, we note that we work with men and boys, in particular due to the ICRC's global work on detention, whereby men and boys form the majority of detainees in a given place of detention. Additionally, our global team has recently conducted research on how to improve our operational response to men, boys, and gender minorities. As with all areas of our work, the ICRC acknowledges that we are one part of the larger humanitarian and nexus prevention and response mechanisms working on this topic. We do feel that the ICRC has a unique role to play in this field, given our level of access, breadth and reach to all beneficiaries, and scope of dialogue and ability to engage authorities with weapon bearers in bilateral and confidential dialogue. Alongside the delivery of these multidisciplinary and human-centered response services, our engagement with governments and authorities at the national and local level is a key aspect in our strategy. Indeed, sexual violence is prohibited under international humanitarian law, and we seek to prevent it by engagement with lawmakers to create a conducive and well-implemented legal environment for addressing it holistically, but also by addressing behaviors, for example, among weapon bearers. In dialogue with all types of authorities, we highlight that in armed conflict, rape, and other forms of sexual violence are serious violations of international humanitarian law, and that all states have obligations to make them crimes under domestic law. We seek to address not just law, but increasingly tackle drivers of sexual violence, such as peer dynamics and armed forces. For example, last year we published guidelines on how to engage state armed forces on addressing sexual violence, and we use these tools in engaging armed forces in these discussions on how to prevent sexual violence, mitigate risks, and respond to it with governments who contributing support and troops to the places in which we work and to the national authorities. Sexual violence response for the ICRC continues to be a priority, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, precisely because this pandemic and its secondary measures are exacerbating risks. We are implementing risk mitigation, new communication such as adapted radio messages, and working on cash-based guidance and delivery to address negative coping mechanisms from the crisis. The ICRC in South Sudan and in all locations where we work will continue to prioritize engagement across a broad spectrum of actors, putting affected populations at the heart of our operations and engagement with authorities based on the rights and needs of the people that we serve. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Christine. And our last panelist is Eleanor Raikes, who's worked in Chad and Afghanistan and Zimbabwe, and also on the Europe refugee crisis, and is currently the Vice President and Head of Programme Delivery at the International Rescue Committee. Now, Eleanor, IRC has a strong focus on women's empowerment and engagement in decision-making in humanitarian settings. What perspective would you offer for today's discussion, please?
Thank you, Mark, and it's an honour to be here among this panel of fabulous, fearless women. I also particularly appreciated hearing from Fatima as a representative of civil society in Nigeria, because to answer your question, I want to start with the point that we need to do better at creating space for women leadership voices that are from the countries and the communities where humanitarian programming is being delivered. It's so fundamental to this question of decision-making and effective delivery of programs that address issues for women and girls in humanitarian contexts. The International Rescue Committee has been and will continue to be deeply invested in partnering with local women's organizations, in particular women-led organizations, as core part of our response in humanitarian settings. We're actually on the cusp of finalizing our new global strategy and conversations about how we can do even better at, as Fatima put it, truly equal partnerships and actually changing power imbalances both within our own organization and across the sector have been front and center to the development of our new global strategy. Mark, you said at the very beginning of this panel that we need leaders from across the sector, not only technical experts on this subject. I am not a technical expert on this subject. I oversee the International Rescue Committee's program delivery across all sectors in Africa, Asia, Middle East, and Latin America. And this is a core part of all of our work. The second thing I would say, therefore, on that question is that to talk about the importance of a truly feminist approach to designing and delivering programs. Feminist approaches, we know, consider power and access. COVID has sharpened our attention on the need, just as one example, on the need to take into account the lack of digital access and literacy among women and girls in many of the contexts that we work in. So all our work has to be informed by this lens across all humanitarian settings, whether working in a COVID context or otherwise. What we've learned with COVID, as with other humanitarian crises, is that GBV services can and must continue, that they are life-saving, that they need to be adapted to the specific challenges that emergency and crisis brings, and that we need to be listening to what the data tells us. So just a few examples from our protection monitoring work in the last few months within the context of COVID. This was mentioned earlier by my colleague from UNFPA. The IRC alone has received over 100 GBV-related suicide attempt or incident reports. We've had a 70% increase in calls to the GBV hotline reported through our local partner in El Salvador. And at the same time, when we analyse the case data, we see reporting falling in some contexts due to the inability to access services, including the technology-based services such as hotlines that have been put in place. We've seen this in Tanzania, we've seen this in Bangladesh. In Iraq, the IRC received no reports of gender-based violence for nearly 2 months before awareness raising for the hotline was able to be increased and women became more aware of ways to report. Following that effort, 65% of service provision points reported an increase or exacerbation in one or more types of GBV. We know, as has been said by my fellow panelists, we know that these issues are exacerbated by any crisis, and that is absolutely the case with COVID. We have to get good data, and we have to be adaptive in how we deliver programs to make sure that we can maintain and continue services to these to vulnerable populations. I would be remiss not to mention that violence against children is also increasing. And it's important, I think, to remember that children in the context of COVID have few, if any, opportunities to report without mandated reporters, such as teachers, because of widespread school closures. So that's also an issue of huge concern. Throughout COVID, we've been continuing to provide case management services in 28 countries. We've been adapting our programs with hygiene protocols, physical distancing, increased attention to hotlines, other digital means of providing continued services, including case management. Adaptations have to be thoughtful, they have to be thorough, and they have to be creative, and they have to be relevant to the specific context. We're prioritizing case management and psychosocial support, clinical care for sexual assault survivors, ticket distributions, risk communication and information sharing through women-led networks. My colleagues have already mentioned, but I want to underscore the importance of funding in this area. We know that it was already before COVID insufficient, and it continues to be the case. When we looked at the global HRP, the GBV request amounts to just $45 million US, which is just 0.676% of the overall request of $6.64 billion for COVID response. Tracking also has to be better so that we can know what is being spent where and what the gaps therefore continue to be. That's still something that we see needs more work and attention, in addition to increasing the absolute amounts of funding. And we continue to call for the rhetoric of GBV programming being life-saving, which we've seen get much better attention in recent years, but it has to be put and translated into action. We have to see governments putting out calls for proposals for gender-based violence, specifically directly to NGOs, particularly to local NGOs. And given the low percentage of funding that is in the GHRP for GBV, we need to see funding being allocated bilaterally and not only through pooled funding mechanisms. So I'll stop there. It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. So we're going to hear now from member states. I know you're all colleagues in the member states delegations be keen to hear again from the panelists before the end of the meeting. In order to facilitate that, your interests are best served by sticking to the allocated time we have available. So please do help us with that. You will hear a beep go off if you speak for longer than the allocated time. So if you could all please restrict yourself to 2 minutes, then you'll be able to hear again from the panelists. I'm really pleased to be able to start with one of the co-hosts from the Oslo conference last year, the United Arab Emirates, the permanent representative, Ambassador Lana Nusseibeh. Lana, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, colleagues. It's so good to see so many good friends here on this fantastic panel and lineup. I'll be as brief as I can, thanking the organizers and the speakers for the great speeches they made today and the leadership they've shown on this issue. And of course, the UAE, as co-host of last year's End SGBV conference in Oslo, pushed strongly for SGBV to be at the center of the humanitarian affairs segment. We're really pleased to see such high turnout and unequivocal support today for addressing this in humanitarian contexts. 3 or 4 quick points. Visibility and funding are going to be key to maintaining this momentum, and we'd like to highlight 3 levers that the UAE sees and intends to pull. First, on mainstreaming, we've been pleased to see SGBV gain standalone recognition in humanitarian response plans. We now call on humanitarian agencies to take the next step by making SGBV training and advisory services mandatory for humanitarian coordinators and country teams, as well as linking SGBV metrics to the performance evaluations of humanitarian staff. We think it's critical to match good intentions with good incentives. Second, we shouldn't always shy away from earmarking to normalize prioritization of the SGBV. We're proud to have announced $10 million in funding for a range of entities at the End SGBV conference, as well as to have earmarked $25 million for UNFPA in one of our largest ever humanitarian contributions to the UN. We heard clearly from SGBV advocates that their budgets are often the first to be slashed, and we believe donor earmarking can be an interim solution. Third, we believe in stronger reporting on SGBV in more places at the UN. To see the Security Council systematically include briefings, data, and proposals on SGBV, much in the same way that we're seeing increased efforts to report on the number of women at the peace negotiation table. This is an ideological, we think it's a practical, results-minded approach. So we can't afford not to do this. Thank you again for a great turnout.
Thank you very much indeed. Next, please, for Japan, Ms. Hiroki Suzuki, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ambassador Hilary and Mr. Markov, for this meeting. Well, sexual and gender-based violence cannot be tolerated in any context, and Japan commits itself to work with the international community to address this issue. We need to combat this violence, although we are currently in a difficult situation with COVID-19, but I would rather say we need to tackle this problem all the more during this pandemic. In this context, I would like to mention some projects we do with UN agencies. One area is sexual violence in conflict. From April this year, in coordination with the Special Representative of the Special Representative of the SG on sexual violence in conflict, we have started a project to prevent conflict-related sexual violence and violent extremism and to address impunity in DRC, Central African Republic, and Somalia. And Japan also has decided to make an additional contribution of 4.5 million US dollars to the UN Women in response to the pandemic. And this includes support for victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Japan believes that this pandemic causes human security crisis that has a wide range of serious consequences, such as people's survival, livelihood, and dignity. So we need to tackle this problem in solidarity. And in conclusion, and I would like to make one question, but we would like to reiterate that under the principle of human security, we will work together with yours. And my question is to the panelists is, I think this event is very meaningful, given that the United Nations has many organizations, not only UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, and Special Representative, and the Office of the Victims' Rights Advocate, etc. So I would like to ask how we can include those agencies, how we can use the knowledge of these various agencies in formulating humanitarian response plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please, Thailand, Ambassador Srivihok.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action at the time of disruption caused by COVID-19, allow me to begin by recognizing the courage and contribution made by all personnel, especially women, in healthcare, essential services, households, and other countless capacity during this pressing time. Challenges that have come with COVID-19 call upon us to step up our efforts to combat and prevent sexual and gender-based violence against any particular groups in humanitarian crisis. Deepened socioeconomic stress coupled with lockdown measures have intensified pre-existing gender inequality and discrimination. Reports of an increase in sexual and gender-based violence is a clear evidence that many people, especially women and girls, still live in vulnerable situations and often in silence. Thailand therefore strongly supports Secretary General's call on gender-based violence and COVID-19, as well as his policy brief on the issue. We further reiterate that special attention must be paid to pregnant women, women living with HIV, and women with disabilities, as they list facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination. On our part, Thailand has stepped up measures to support women and girls amidst the pandemic. We have opened 8 Women Development Centers to provide unemployed and homeless women with shelter, food, occupational training. We have also extended a debt moratorium to relieve the economic impact of COVID-19, from which over 240,000 women have benefited. With zero tolerance policy, women and girls at least can also seek support from our helplines, which provide assistance to victims of domestic violence and connect them with protection services and remedies. Thailand is determined to working closely with our partners around the world to further strengthen our fight to end sexual and gender-based violence in our setting. Only then can we advance progress toward achieving the 2030 agenda without leaving anyone behind. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next for the European Union, Mr. Silvio Gonzato. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Under Secretary General, and congrats for displaying such an impressive array of engaged and powerful women on such a topical issue. As many of you have already indicated, the current epidemic has provided yet again evidence, as if we needed it, that crisis exacerbates structural gender inequalities And we've seen reports showing increased levels of gender-based violence. This is why it's so important that we continue our essential work, such as responding to violence. We in the European Union have provided a package, the so-called Team Europe package, that equals nowadays 36 billion euro, to try and help our partners around the world provide a robust, comprehensive response to the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly for vulnerable populations outside the EU. We're also working on trying to adapt EU-funded humanitarian actions to factor in the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, we want to ensure that the delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance continues, including the prevention and response to gender-based violence, so that we don't want to be distracted by this, by the COVID pandemic in this respect. And in 2019, just to give you an illustration of our commitment, we allocated approximately 26 million euros of our humanitarian aid budget specifically to prevent and respond to gender-based violence worldwide. We're also part of the global initiative Call to Action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, and we're very active there, and we look forward to the new roadmap that will aim at ensuring an effective humanitarian response to the plague of gender-based violence. Our work on gender and gender-based violence and humanitarian aid is long from being finished. Risk mitigation needs to become a reflex for all humanitarian workers, and we need to continue advocating for better responses to GBV from the start of any crisis. So my question is, what can we do more and better to ensure that gender mainstreaming and gender-based violence risk mitigation becomes part of the DNA of humanitarian workers? And how do we foster this shift in attitude? Thank you very much, Mr. Lopez.
Thank you. Next, please, Germany. Ms. Karen Goebel, please. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the chair, Ambassador Hilal, and all of our panelists for making this issue a priority of the ECOSOC has. I think the testimonies we have heard today were a stark illustration why we really need to better address this pressing issue in the current situation, but also in general. We fully agree with what has been said. It is high time that we apply the lessons learned and the commitments made since Beijing 25 years ago, and also since Resolution 1325 was adopted 2 decades ago, and since the call to action on protection from gender-based violence and emergencies and the Oslo conference last year. Germany is fully committed to this goal, for example, by applying a dedicated gender age disability marker on all funding applications we receive, or by leading the negotiations to Security Council Resolution 2467, a follow-up resolution to 1325 during Germany's Security Council presidency last April. In the framework of our humanitarian assistance, we are supporting SGBV-related measures and initiatives. As donors and actors in this unprecedented crisis, we are now more than ever obliged to make sure the humanitarian response we are supporting is set up to be conscious of and includes measures to counter sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please, Canada, Deputy Permanent Representative Richard Arbeiter. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jillian Gillen in place of Richard. I'd like to thank many of the panelists for the references to the call to action from gender-based violence in emergencies. And Canada, as the lead of this, shares, of course, our deep concern about the increasing rate of gender-based violence as a result and during this pandemic. Let's hold each other accountable to affected populations to deliver gender-responsive humanitarian programming. This is necessary to meet the differentiated needs of vulnerable populations. It is not the responsibility of a single organization to prevent and mitigate gender-based violence, but for all humanitarian actors. And so we invite those, and so many of you are members of the call to action, but for those who may not be familiar with the joint statement that Canada issued on gender-based violence and COVID-19 on behalf of the 85 call to action partners, The statement outlines what we will need to do to place the safety of women and girls at the center of the COVID-19 response. Canada welcomes and encourages collective action, as has been discussed today. And we have the same question that others have raised, and which I thank Eleanor and Fatima for speaking to on the panel, about how we can further support humanitarian actors, including women's rights organizations, through partnership to ensure that gender-based violence services are recognized as life-saving and essential throughout the COVID-19 response. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Next, please, Ambassador Martin Herman for Denmark. Martin, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mark, and thank you to you and Omar, and I think all the panelists. And then I want to express my deep gratitude and admiration to all the staff in the field who are literally saving lives every day. Now, I have 3 points to make. First of all, we are extremely worried about reports that restrictive measures designed to limit the spread of COVID-19 around the world, in fact, increases the risk of domestic violence, including intimate partner violence, as Natalia said earlier. And this is the reality, I think, in both developing and developed countries, including mine. Now, as health and social protection, as well as legal systems that protect women and girls are weakened under pressure for COVID-19, there will be a higher need of assistance in preventing violence against women and girls. Now, I think in emergency response, it's absolutely crucial that all women and girls continue to be protected from gender-based violence. And as a consequence of the pandemic actually disproportionately affecting women, it is particularly important that protection from gender-based violence is given the needed attention in the global humanitarian response to COVID-19. Now, in the global humanitarian response, we need to ensure that sexual and reproductive health needs of women and girls, including psychosocial support services, continues to be prioritized. This is to ensure, quite simply, continuity and avoid a rise in maternal and newborn mortality, and avoid a rise in increased unmet need for contraception, and of course, an increased number of unsafe abortions and sexually transmitted infections. Now, more restrictive access to proper health services, contraception, family planning, and safe abortion will actually make life even more unsafe for women and girls. And we must ensure that the health crisis does not turn into a protection crisis. Now, finally, ensuring life-saving assistance and protecting the most vulnerable in this global crisis requires strong, multilateral, and rules-based cooperation. And we would like to sincerely thank the UN organizations, including your organization, Mark Ocha, for their prompt and coordinated response in addressing the most urgent humanitarian needs through the Global Humanitarian Response Plan, which we have supported from Denmark's side. Now, it must be a response plan founded in humanitarian of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, as well as in the relevant humanitarian resolution, emphasizing that everyone, including women and girls, must have access to all essential life-saving humanitarian assistance and health services. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next, please, for Guatemala, Ambassador Luis Lan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, for giving me the floor and convening this important high-level event. Guatemala recognizes the relevance of the topic, especially at the time when the COVID-19 pandemic has directly affected on the lives of women, adolescents, and girls, people in conditions of vulnerability of exclusion, as well as indigenous people, older persons, and persons living with disability. Mindful that in many countries the level of violence against women has increased during the COVID-19 crisis, we stress that this must be addressed urgently. We are very concerned that for many women and girls, the threat of violence is highest now, precisely when they should be in the safest condition in their own homes, taking into account that containment and quarantine are essential to reduce the spread of the virus. Women play an essential role in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. In Latin America, 74% of people employed in the health and social sectors are women. Despite this, while being the main providers of these basic services, they are often excluded from leadership and decision-making roles in this sector. Gender discrimination continues to be an obstacle to the full individual development of women, and it is also an impediment to achieve the goals of Agenda 2030 for development. In particular, SDG 5 and 8. The government of Guatemala, led by the President Alejandro Yamatei, has made a strong call and is working tirelessly with several government institutions to put an end on this scourge. The three branches of the state are taking measures and coordinating efforts to ensure the incorporation of women's needs in the emergency response. A hotline has been put in place to report incidents to the police, and we have redoubled efforts to have public officers adequately trained at the local level. We express our appreciation for the work done by UN Women in Guatemala, which is now in the process of compiling data on the effects of the COVID-19 emergency on women. We value UN Women as a strategic partner in the various efforts and work of women's empowerment in many countries. To conclude, it is inevitable to ask myself one question: how can we prevent violence against women? Well, by empowering women in every way throughout their life. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Next, please, the representative of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the outset, please allow me to extend my warmest thanks to all our distinguished panelists for their important words today. Mr. Chairman, in Afghanistan, COVID-19 is occurring on top of a protracted conflict that has resulted in an increasingly dire humanitarian situation. Women and girls are facing reduced access to critical services, not only in healthcare, but for gender-based violence assistance. But Afghanistan is responding. The laws enshrined in our constitution provide a legal basis for the empowerment and protection of women who suffer from violence. Community workers throughout the country continue to conduct outreach to women and girls, even when reporting mechanisms have been limited due to the pandemic. We are working closely with various UN agencies to ensure that we continue to raise awareness of GBV resources throughout the country. A new